Okay, let's wait. Okay, good morning, good people. We are live on a Wednesday morning. It is hump day. It is cold in South Africa, in eThekwini, but we're gonna still get it popping. You can see I'm bundled up, but you know, the day must persist. So today we're gonna follow up from what we started off on Monday, which was basically going through the first initial stages of the AFRO-LIT, 101, where we're breaking down this article called Ubuntu Magic. And what we were specifically going over was the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. And this is from a movie by Christopher Nolan called The Prestige, where he breaks down the formula of a magic trick. But further, what I wanted to do is basically show how the magic has been done to kind of bring African Americans a level of amnesia of their African history. And it's done by basically the same type of formula of a magic trick, in my opinion. And I kind of break down a pledge of like the first initial step where the African American is presented a version of themselves as an African, but it's not in a more glamorous type of situation. It's more of something that you want to disassociate with, something that, they're trying to prompt you to kind of disassociate with, and you kind of maybe rebel against that as somebody that's taught about Africa, but then you go on the spectrum of becoming like fanatical about your understanding of Africa. But either way that you're on the spectrum, you're either on the far side of like demonizing, wanting to dissociate with your African history, or you like fantasizing about it, and you kind of like, really going in like a mythological pathway, but neither gives you the true accurate sense of what may be going on. So the purpose of what my live is, of this AFRO-LIT 101 is to kind of break down some of my experience as somebody that's Engishlala, eThekwini, Amayakanani for, I've been living in South Africa for 4 years, in Gepume Peshe, in Dolobin, in New Orleans. And since I've been here, in Givakshelo, Mdiniwame, they visited as well, and we've all been able to kind of like get a deeper understanding of what Africa means to us versus like what has been presented to us. So the pledge is the first scenario, and then following up from the pledge is when you have the next phases, which is basically what we're going to go into now. Is after you are presented a version of Africa, first they give you the pledge of like, okay, this is a version of who you are, but now we've civilized you in terms of, after the chattel slavery, now you can have the opportunity to become American, and it's an opportunity for you. And why would you want to go back? And then from that point on, there's a lot of narrative bending to where a lot of people don't even know where to go back to if they want to understand who they are in terms of their African lineage. So this is something that we take a turn in the narrative. It's like first they pledge you with, okay, this is what you are, and then the turn of it is make it disappear. And in that is by confusion. It's like that is the real thing that, takes place in terms of, helping you forget and have that amnesia of Africa. And then while you're in America as an African American, it's like it's hard for you to kind of get reminded because there's no real relics or no people to say, okay, this is who you truly are. I know your people, and speak your language. Like you have so many things that are blocking you from being able to retrace your steps to who you are actually. So this is kind of like what I go in terms of this next phase of the article, which is called the turn. And we left off just talking about how an objective framework is what you want to try to build. The last paragraph of the pledge series is just basically going into the situation to where, as we are indoctrinated into a Western education, we kind of, compartmentalize things, and we kind of are, breaking down some things that we are presented as verifiable fact without going through do the research of either, having online engagement or, visiting the place ourselves. And I've been a practitioner of both forms of research, so that's why I've been able to expand my capacity to identify hidden nuances that broaden my understanding into a more objective framework. So I'm not subjecting, the people before I meet them. I'm kind of having more of an empathetic, reasoning by actually, coming in contact with a lot of the people that, I've been projected as, the Zulu people or, Congo, or just all of the things that we are kind of referenced to, but aren't actually in depth in our understanding. And for the people that's joining on TikTok or, anywhere else, I just want to say Sani Bunani, good morning. I know it's early, 6:46, but yes, I thank you guys for tuning in and showing some love. Yes, we're going to continue to just go forward because I want to try to get this done today. So going forward, we have the turn. The turn is basically like the disappearance and the confusion that takes place of the narrative. So we're going to go into the article reading that allows for us to kind of understand what we do to kind of break away from that and how this is hurting us in terms. So this photo that we have here is actually a photo of what I took in front of the workshop in Durban, eThekwini. And it's a beautiful photo that I was just kind of, just seeing the nature of the people, and like you can see the different dress, this different style of dress, and the different like, cultural practices just in, the different age groups of the people of South Africa. So this is more recent that I took this photo, and I also do photography along with the article writing and along with the poetry. Okay, so going forward, let's start our reading. Ubuntu Magic declares the turn in prestige. We are now speaking on the turn. So, alleviating personal attachments can lead towards cognitive neutrality, which may assist in the detoxification process necessary for a more compassionate comprehension. So this sentence is basically trying to give into the aspect of you want to kind of break away from that Western and English education and, not have a personal attachment at first, so that you can kind of get away from the, being leaning towards a fantasy side of viewing Africa, or a more demonization view of Africa. You want to kind of get to a sense of neutrality. And this is the detoxification process, so that when you're taking in information, that it's not necessarily, being, filtered through your Western mind and through your biases that you may have from living in a Western environment. So the importance of these adjustments may not be evident to those currently comfortable in stagnant circumstances, but many of our predecessors had to forcibly sacrifice their well-being for these descendants to experience the results of their more transformative example. So we're just trying to give acknowledgement to the ancestors who, had to go through the process of maybe being on a slave ship, or even before having to migrate throughout the places of Africa. And that kind of brings a different level of, empathy towards the importance of having a mindset that isn't so stagnant and having to adjust, and like the type of, character that builds, and people are benefiting from that today. Like, I have, my grandparents, and they have a long lineage of stuff that I benefit from as an American today. And that is something that I don't take for granted, but it's also, I have to kind of acknowledge that in terms of how I want to move, and know that, I can adjust, and I can be, more liquid in my, approach to life. I don't have to be stagnant in my mind frame from where I am. So going forward, behind the heavily debated myriad of migrations throughout Africa, along with the subsequent exodus towards the Americas, the underlying shifts in mentality of the travelers are consistent. So we're talking about now this consistent, a level to adapt that African Americans and their history, kind of have built up. Is that this malleability is something that you can kind of expect from African Americans that, want to be more like their ancestors that had to go through the levels of being in multiple different places and just not being stuck in one mind frame. And it's more of a tool for you to be able to actually practice humanity and be able to move as a world builder and move around the world, rather than being stagnant in one place and just being conditioned in the framework that, you was brought up in terms of Western environment, because that's the thing that limits us in a sense. So we're just talking about how, that capacity is the measures that take place once you are growing up in a Western environment. It's kind of like you already have the limitations of where you can go. There's not too many, places on the spectrum of what they have, available for you, until you get off of that environment and kind of start to have more of an organic development outside of the transformation that's available. Because the transformation is just from, you once were a chattel slave, and now you can become maybe a civilian in some capacity, it may be limited, but then from there you can graduate to like a capitalist, an entertainer, a politician. But all of this has already been calculated for you, and they kind of can measure, your threat level to, being able to shake up the system to become what you truly are, because they kind of know the levels of where you will go. But until you have like more of an organic development outside of that, that is something that, our ancestors was able to, be a part of. And it was also, disrupted, on the land of Africa. They had a level of cultural disruption in terms of colonialism, imperialism. But in the midst of it all, they still adopt that consistency of being able to, have a shift in mentality and be able to be aware of that and practice that and not be stagnant. So this is something that, we all deal with. This can help those in African American, the youth of African Americans, and the youth of Africa, because everybody has some level of condition that in the systems that, have disrupted their actual organic development. But as we go along, we will see that change remains the constant source of momentum, strengthening their adaptive nature while also guiding the wiser of their posterity's intuitive foresight. So this is something that, you can inherit this level of just being able to adapt. And it's something that, people that have more of an inclination of intuition of change and being able to move with the wind kind of, you kind of can inherit something more than just financial things. You inherit basically ancestral wisdom. You inherit like basically the ability to be able to see through certain things and be able to pick up on signs and patterns. And if you are, in tune to it, if you align to it, you can kind of practice it more and build up that muscle to be able to kind of enjoy life on a different spectrum than what you may have if you're only limited towards, what is told to you is the ladder of progression. So change remains the constant source of momentum, strengthening our adaptive nature while also guiding the wiser of our posterity's intuitive foresight. So this is for the posterity as well. Posterity is for the generations that come after you. Determining definitive behavior based upon these inherited inclinations is validated by modern pursuits that may advance our cerebral malleability in the contemporary age. So this is basically like when you define your behavior based upon these inherited inclinations of being able to be spiritually in tune with your ancestors and being able to inherit that type of, appreciation for them and show them acknowledgement, you kind of see that the modern pursuits that may advance our cerebral malleability in the contemporary age kind of validates that is something that of importance, because now you aren't stagnant. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of modern transformation that we go through today, and our ability to even adapt in these measures, consistently having to see the next thing that somebody's bringing in, the new innovation, and we are still in an aspect of being able to survive, being able to be resilient, being able to have joy as African Americans and African people in the midst of the constant developments that are, I would say is out to harm you. But, you can kind of flip it and kind of use it as an advancement, because technology in a sense is, both being a nuisance to maybe the employment area or to people's attention spans. But you can still, use it in the capacity that I'm trying to use it here to kind of build basically a communication, a research repository so people can know more about their history and tap in a little bit further. Let me see if there's anybody tapped in before we continue forward. Thank you guys for joining in on TikTok. I'm currently on YouTube as well. If you guys want to read along, or you can go to Substack, Mr. Responsible at Substack, to be able to tap into the article that we're reading as well, so you can follow along. Going forward. So the malleability in the contemporary age. So we're going to talk about now the traditional rites of passage, ceremonial instructions, and patrilineal plan structures that carefully preserve genealogies may be exclusively attributed to the Hebraic commandments in the Bible's Old Testament by those disconnected from ancient African customs. So this is where we get into the real aspect of, our history of being able to adapt, in the midst of even, Christianity being something that was shifting, a lot of people's perspective to abandon maybe their traditional paths. But from an African-American standpoint, you may look at these customs that you read in the Bible, of ceremonial instructions and the patrilineal plan structures. These things that have carefully preserved genealogies, and they may look at it as something that is strictly, to the Old Testament. But in my travels, like to Mbini, Kokstad, Port Shepstone, I've been able to see the traditional passages, and that's what, the traditional, practices and the customs of South Africa in particular, and of the people that speak more of the Nguni or Bantu language. And it's been able to expose me to that a lot of these customs that you may find in the Old Testament are actually practiced in the Bible, in the rules of Africa as well. And a lot of people, was able to give me more information about it when I posed this question on my Instagram and on my TikTok. I was just talking about the connection or the disconnection between the Hebrew customs and the Nguni and Bantu speaking Africans' customs, and how there's a similarity. And I noticed that, and people gave me a lot of insight, and that's what I was able to feed this article, so I want to continue that engagement with you guys and make sure that your voice is being heard as well. So I try to include the insight that I get from, my TikTok engagement, from my Instagram engagement, from my Facebook engagement in my articles, so that we can have a constant ability to, keep the dialogue going. Because this AFRO-LIT 101 is not about education. It's more about keeping our dialogue going so that we can have a research repository for people that are interested in these type of topics. And that's something that I think is powerful for, those that are trying to build basically their level of engagement or their level of community through these platforms of TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. especially on TikTok, you can do a lot of community building because people are really engaging a lot with the audience when you kind of give feedback towards the topics that people pose. So that is a strategy that I've used to build my profile in terms of making sure that when I'm posing a question, I'm able to get the insight and gather the insight, and then use the tools that I share in this AFRO-LIT 101 to be able to basically show you how to turn those insights and analyze the data and be able to turn it into some level of outcome and expression, which I do in article writing. I can also do in music. I can also do just in storytelling or just in making a product, a business product. Everything is based in research, and the research comes from basically engaging with your community. So with your TikTok, or with your social media profile, you want to kind of build it into a tool to where you can kind of, like I'm saying, adapt to these new tools that we have rather than it being only something that you're a consumer on. You can be a producer of content, you can pose questions, you can get engagement from your audience, and from there you can kind of build basically a database for you to analyze and put into your expression, so that when you put something out, if you're a creative or you're an entrepreneur, you can make sure that it's validated in the research that you've done rather than just putting it out and hoping that people support you. So that is the feedback that you need in terms of being able to make sure that this is something that is valuable to you. Going forward, we're going to just continue the article that we have here. Additionally, so we're saying the traditional rites of passage, ceremonial instructions, and patrilineal clan structures that carefully preserve genealogies may be exclusively attributed to the Hebraic commandments in the Bible's Old Testament by those disconnected from ancient African customs. But additionally, the New Testament worship of a Christ figure used to invoke a higher power also carries familiarity with the ritual acknowledgement of ancestors found in the antique covenants predating popular Western religions. So even when you go to the New Testament, like we're talking about, there's similarities in the Old Testament, but from my insights from the people that was, engaging with me and on my time here on the land of South Africa, I was able to see that the acknowledgement of ancestors is more similar to like the acknowledgement of a Christ figure that is in a Christian practice. And it's like there is been practicing this level of, ancestral worship, because I believe that the Bible is a real ancestral, heavy book, because you can see this in the beginning of the New Testament. The first thing they do is give the lineage of Jesus all the way to David and all the way back to Abraham. Like there's a whole lineage situation, and then Christ is kind of coming back to kind of fulfill the prophecy of that lineage that he came from. So this idea of ancestral worship that happens in the Bible, I don't know if it's worship, but just ancestral acknowledgement is also practiced in the societies of Africa, the customs of Africa, way before any of this Western religion came about. So being ultimately limited to channeling our closest deceased relatives shouldn't prevent African Americans from prioritizing synchronization with their own bloodlines in congruence with the parasocial deification encouraged in Christianity. This is a really important sentence because it's something that I kind of practice now since I've been able to learn. I've transitioned, or let me say I've developed more of a practice of honoring my own ancestors versus only having a parasocial deification of Christ that's encouraged in Christianity. And parasocial is basically like, how do you kind of have a relationship with a celebrity? It's kind of like you are encouraged to basically, look at the celebrity as if it's somebody that you actually know. And that's something that is encouraged in Christianity in terms of your relationship with Christ. And it's not nothing that I'm saying to not do, but I'm saying in the midst of that, that shouldn't limit you from also acknowledging your own ancestors, whether it be your closest, grandparents that may have passed, anybody that's made it to the ancestral realm that you had an actual connection with. It's very powerful for you to be able to tap in with them in terms of just acknowledging them, telling them about your life, giving communication with them, asking them questions about, what you may be doing right or wrong. And also in that realm, this is something that I solely believe. I don't know if it's the truth or not, but in my teachings, in my studies of like the writers like Masisi Kunene, which is an African poet, they talk about how this is a whole world outside of, this spectrum that we're on Earth that exists in this ancestral world. And it's a lot of communication and it's a lot of limitless, possibilities and capabilities. And that's something that I really acknowledge. Is like, there isn't the one type of, destiny that you may have when you are on Earth. Once you transcend to the ancestral realm, like there's ultimate options. Like you could be living multiple lives and you can kind of project different type of versions of your, ancestors. Of you can maybe correct some of the decisions and see like if they will be happier if they made this pathway, and you can kind of play with that because they are in a realm where there isn't the limitations that we have on Earth. There is more of an open-ended area And this is just me getting into the imagination of it all, of course, but it's something that I just practice in terms of, if I feel like something that have led us astray, maybe something that we can correct in the history of our ancestors. This is a possibility to do it through meditation and through this acknowledgement that you may do on a daily basis. And it's the same thing. You have to build the muscle to be able to make this something that you actually can believe and put forth to generations that come after you. It's just, building basically a real orb of your ancestral power. And I think this is what the clan songs do. Makote Wame is Isibongo Isake. Makote Wame Isibongo Sake, I'm a Zulu, and it's Mshlongo, Njomani, Bebe. And I understand that this clan song aspect kind of allows for you to tap into the powers of, your ancestral song and how to understand your song. So I kind of take that approach, even though I'm from African American, sorry. Even though I am African American and I don't necessarily know the lineage all the way back, because of what we're talking about, this turn of, taking us away from Africa. But the immediate ancestry that I'm able to tap into is still important, even like if it's just my great-grandparents or my grandparents that may have passed, it's still something that you can tap into. So that's what I'm going in terms of this part of the article. Going forward, let me see. Shout out to everybody that's tapping in. I see my brother, he knows that it's true. Thank you for your comment on TikTok. You can tap in and see the full article on Substack if you would like to read more, but I'm going to continue what we have going on. So alienating immediate, let me read that last sentence again because it's a really powerful sentence. So being ultimately limited to channeling our closest deceased relatives shouldn't prevent African Americans from prioritizing synchronization with their own bloodlines in congruence with the parasocial deification encouraged in Christianity. Alienating immediate contributors to one's personal existence in exchange for symbolic unification with a supposed representative of all mankind can be argued as an intentional rerouting of sacred energy to be harvested through outright predatory deception. So this is kind of, we get into more of the predatory aspect of the Christianity, is that, once you eliminate alienate your own ancestral worship and you replace it with a Christian figure, it's kind of like it could be some level of deception that's going on to harvest that sacred energy that you may have. And this is happening in Africa, it's happening in America, it's happening like throughout the Black diaspora, is that, a lot of people are abandoning their ancestral worship for worship of a Christ figure, and it's more of a parasocial relationship with like a celebrity, basically. It's like you are giving that acknowledgement, the same thing that you see in celebrities, and people are obsessed with celebrities when they could be, having that same type of acknowledgement and appreciation for those that actually have a presence in their life, maybe your father, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, or somebody that, really sets your destiny in a certain path. This is something that's really important for you to acknowledge, but a lot of people replace the acknowledgement of those figures for a Christ figure. And understanding that is not the best practice if you are really trying to, keep intact your integral heritage. It's like more of a predatory thing that is giving energy towards another culture and another people. So that is something that I'm also just breaking down in terms of what is the problem that is not encouraging African Americans to kind of tap into their African history, because they're like tied up into the Christian worship. Presumptuous accusations such as these could be heralded as far-fetched if it weren't for the countless catastrophes suffered at the hands of the empires that shadowed the missionaries spreading this ostensibly glorified narrative. So these last two sentences is going to set us up for the next paragraph, but it's really just trying to break down that, this alienation of your own ancestors by way of this deception to like usurp your energy and towards another person's, history and their practices. And I understand that there's some people believe that, the Christianity is more of a Black practice as well. But nonetheless, it's like a lot of people are still, obsessed with the more of the European version. And that was backed by the missionaries that kind of, that was shadowed by the empires of colonialism and imperialism. So in the midst of, people trying to identify themselves, they're like, I know this practice because as an African American, I went through that journey myself of, studying the Bible and seeing that there's a connection in terms of the lost tribe of Shabazz or the lost tribe of Israel, and that African Americans can be, in tune with being, the Israelites, the real Israelites. That is a belief that is persisted upon. And even, people that speak Bantu in Southern Africa, that is something that people believe. I know that there's a Shembe practice in Southern Africa. I've been able to witness those practices and those customs. But all in all, I believe that, you know, a majority of people are still, you know, giving their attention to, you know, more of the Christian European version of this, or the Roman Catholic version. And that aspect is backed by the missionaries that were, you know, backed, you know, and funded by colonial imperialism. And that is something that I see as it still isn't the solution until you kind of like get into an aspect of really knowing who you are and acknowledging your immediate, you know, family. Then you can kind of branch off into a further aspect of maybe tracing your heritage back to the Hebrew customs. But I think in the immediate, especially for African Americans, it's like it's a priority for you to kind of tap in with your own first and try to understand who you are before you give your energy elsewhere, you know, and just fill the void with the idea that, okay, I may be, you know, the Hebrew Israelite because the story is similar. And not to say that that's the wrong way. I understand that pathway as well, but some people, you know, are still caught up in the other version of religion and Christianity. Let me see where we are now. So going forward, okay, spiritual enslavement layered upon the erasure of accurate origins manufactures a superstructure dependent on belief in the common ideology that fosters non-resistant assimilation. So this is going into what a superstructure is. Basically, like this is like a Marxism term that people kind of, you know, frame it into communism and socialism. But a superstructure is basically like ideology that kind of, you know, has something that people build basically structure on top of. And the spiritual enslavement that we went through as African Americans, or the spiritual enslavement of Christianity, of worshiping somebody outside of your own ancestors, and layering that spiritual enslavement upon the erasure of your accurate origins, it manufactures a new superstructure dependent on belief in the common ideology that fosters non-resistant assimilation. So when you are, you know, becoming passive because of Christianity and you're practicing things that make you non-rebellious, it kind of puts you in the ideology to make you dependent on the new superstructure. And that is something that is a part of the deception practice, in my opinion. So I don't know if you can kind of let me know if you agree with this or not, but a lot of people that you see in terms of this Christianity, they are practicing any of those type of religions, like even Islam. Like both of those practices, they don't basically encourage you to kind of buck against the system, or kind of, it kind of pacify you in terms of if you have any questions to kind of just, you know, pray it away, or, you know, there's no really action in it towards getting your answers that you need. And that is something that I feel like is a part of the deception that takes place with the spiritual enslavement of Christianity in these Western, you know, or European religions versus what you should be practicing in terms of acknowledging your African ancestry. I know this may be heavy for the morning. I'm sorry, guys, but this is what needs to be done. And there's a later class that y'all can tap into where we get more in depth in terms of where this information come from, because I'm telling you guys what the surface level is. And basically, like, I go into the article, the finished product, and then I reverse engineer the African literature in my later classes around 8:30 to 10:30 p.m. to where you can get a little bit of insight of where I gathered this information from, which is basically the dialogue that I've had with, you know, those that have commented on my post about these situations. And you can follow and engage more at Mr. Responsible and Associates. And that is the purpose of, you know, this class, is kind of just showing the process of somebody that's African American that have unlearned a lot of that by living in Africa, in South Africa for 4 years. And I've been able to document a lot of that information. And I basically reverse engineer what I've documented and gather, you know, some level of insight for those that are interested in maybe why we have a disassociation between the diaspora, or why there may be diaspora wars and all of this stuff that is propagated online. But when in actuality, when you connect with people, you can see that there's more of a humanization. And I think the online atmosphere kind of just, you know, amplifies a lot of the negativity. Like, there should be more of a positive exchange. And when you come human to human, that's what happens. It's like the online exists in a place where people can just throw ideas, but when you see somebody in person, that kind of stuff is nullified. Like, you get to actually have a human to human exchange and see somebody eye to eye, and you can really understand what's going on. But in the meantime, we have to utilize these tools. So this is what AFRO-LIT 101 is. So if you are tapping in now and you want to get more of an in-depth, you know, understanding of how these articles came about and how you can use research to back your own creative expression, you can tap in at 8:30 to 10:30 on YouTube or on Twitch. So make sure you subscribe on those areas at Responsible or Mr. Responsible. You'll find me. All right, we got this last little section. We're going to finish off at 7:30. So let's see. We left off. So even though these attempts at complete dismemberment are futile due to our anatomy's genetics, Temporary separation from my primordial kinfolk is achieved through the adopted indulgence of cooperating with this scriptural performance. So this sentence here is tapping into the aspect of, there is basically an attempt to dismember us from our, true history. But in the end of the day, it's futile because of the strong genetics that we have. We're always going to wake up with that Ubuntu in our spirit. Even if you're an African American, if you are Southern African and then lineages, down the line, you have a son that is separated completely from you. They're still going to have that genetic, inclination of that ancestral connection, even though there's going to be a lot of attempts to kind of separate that person and dismember. Like I said, these attempts are futile, but temporarily the separation does, separate us from being able to immediately connect with people because our mind frames are just broken away from who we should be engaging with. And we're kind of now being basically nested in a place where you are just disassociating further and further on the outside through your actions. But internally, there is no really disconnection because of your genetic, unless you're just, flushing out all of your melanin from, mingling with other people. But they're still going to have that inkling of blackness in you, no matter, how much they try to separate it from you. That is a real powerful aspect of this journal, this article, in the Ubuntu magic side of it, because that Ubuntu is basically like that humanization that you practice. And regardless of anything that's going on, the Southern hospitality that you may find in America, the hospitality that I've been given here in Africa, it's like something that is just human nature, that is an example against what has been practiced in terms of these colonial practices, imperialistic practices of European and other descents. Like, we are always like a welcoming people, no matter where you may find us on the world. And that is something that I feel like is inherited, despite all of the attempts to kind of separate us from what's going on. So unnecessary points of connection emerge once unfounded arrogance prompts the newly converted to persuade outsiders that considering the path that they've discovered will show obedience to the infinite campaign against any other form of hereditary reverence. So this is going further into that point of, there's points of contention that emerge once, these people that are converted into maybe, Christianity or Islam or different practices, they try to convince those that are more, practicing their ancestral custom that what they're doing are the wrong way, that they are doing savage, practices based upon the biblical teachings that they may have. And it's creating levels of, contention when that arrogance prompts them to kind of go in that type of way. And I've been a part of those type of circles where, somebody may have a newfound, or they may be rebirthed in Christianity or rebirthed in some new information of